time has come to tell the truth.
I'll wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined once again by Glen O'Hara, a Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at Oxford Brookes University, and the author of a wonderful new book that's just been released, New Labour, New Britain, How the Blair Governments Reshaped the Country. Welcome back to the podcast, Glen.
Hi, Will. It's great to be back.
It's wonderful to have you back. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is, what made you want to write this book about New Labour and specifically Tony Blair now? Why did you think it was a good time to write this book at this point?
Well, I think it partly comes out of personal experience and it partly comes out of, I suppose, Labour's endless civil wars and our endless political tribal civil wars as well. The first thing is personal experience because I'm extremely old and I remember all of this happening, and I was interested in it at the time as a phenomenon rather than, necessarily purely as a partisan. Although broadly I was sympathetic, as people can tell from my kind of journalism output or social media output. So I wanted to kind of pick over it and look at some of the papers, some of the stats, do some interviews, get out there and really think about it and disassemble it. Of course, COVID cut into a lot of that because I'd started this just before COVID, and then COVID derailed it for a couple of years, really, especially child rearing during COVID. So firstly, it was personal interest, but I think more interestingly, intellectually, I wanted to look at New Labour as phenomena, New Labour as kind of project, and also a set of concrete policies, because Blair has become a bit of a lightning rod, and Gordon Brown to a slightly lesser extent of who you are, of what tribe you're in, especially during the long Corbyn wars, if we can describe them as that inside the Labour Party. And I wanted to say, well, actually, what did Labour do? How successful was it? What were the good policies? What were the bad policies? And how did they do it? How did they pull off being so popular for so long? So I think to take, secondly, a bit of a more dispassionate look at it, like people did after 25, 30 years after Harold Wilson had left office, or people are now starting to look at Thatcher after she'd left office and think about, well, let's take the heat out of it and put a bit more light on it. So I guess that's a really long answer about I was interested in it and I wanted to find more stuff out.
Yeah. But I think it's really interesting, the point that you kind of like make about obviously having lived, through the New Labour period as well. Do you think that gives you kind of like a different perspective? And does that in some ways make it sort of like a bit more challenging in some senses in how to approach it as history? Because, as compared to writing maybe a history about, the Attlee government or kind of like the Liberal governments of the, early 20th centuries, this is something that you have a kind of like a much more of a link to and has lived through. Was that like a challenge, or was that in some ways an advantage, the sense that it is sort of like partly still living history in a sense?
It is a challenge because we can't, with all the best will in the world, we can't move out of what we think of New Labour, especially when you did sort of observe it day to day, as it were. And there is that emotional feeling which is partly generational. So, of course, in the early days of New Labour, I was in my early 20s or my late teens. So, everything felt great. and now everything hurts. And now if I fell on the ground, I would bounce, and now I'd shatter, So there is that there's a genuine bodily emotional connectivity and a kind of a mental and emotional connectivity, which makes it a bit harder. But that said, I think you can, for those people who are listening who don't know me, I'm a professional historian. You can bring those techniques that you would have used on any government to this government. So in previous lives, I've written about the Wilson government quite a lot, and I've written about post-war governments quite a lot, and I've also thought a lot about the new Liberal governments, which is interesting you raise, because in many ways they were a lot like New Labour. New Liberalism, New Labour. There's a lot of crossovers there, and what I wanted to do was say, well, let's try and use some of those tools that we would take to any government and look at the Blair era. So if you looked at, I don't know, if you looked at Gladstone, you'd look at the influence of evangelical Christianity
Mm.
and the chapel, wouldn't you? You'd look at the idea of providence and the idea that kind of God had picked him out to kind of solve, quote unquote, the Irish problem. It's never the British problem, isn't it? It's always the Irish problem. But you'd look at Gladstone's intellectual development from early Tory through Peelism to feeling that a more liberal, I don't know, constellation of nations like devolution, as we call it, would be the answer to the UK's problems in some ways. So I wanted to bring some of those tools. So I think it is a problem, but as long as we admit it and we expose what Peter Hennessy, I suppose, once called the hidden wiring of what we're doing and how we're doing it, I think that's okay. And I've been very frank about that. I've written about it quite a lot about someone who's fairly critically sympathetic, but also writing about it as a historian. There's no shame in where you're coming from as long as you say where you're coming from.
Mm. And one thing I think that's particularly interesting about the book is your focus very much on the domestic policies and achievements of
Hmm.
New Labour, of Blair, as compared to the kind of like the looming spectre of Iraq, which is obviously being particularly invoked at the moment. To what extent do you think that this is one of the real difficulties of writing about Blair, about writing about the New Labour era, that people always want to talk
Mm.
about kind of like the foreign policy or trying to put Blair firmly in the prism of foreign policy and foreign adventurism rather than focusing on that kind of like domestic agenda, which was at the heart of the 1997
Mm.
campaign and 2001 campaign, and sometimes gets overlooked a bit in terms of talking about his impact and his legacy.
Yeah, that's a good point actually you make that I hadn't thought of, which is that if we go back to 97 and 2001, so if we go back behind 9/11 and we look forwards, not back in Blairite phraseology, um, actually foreign policy, except Europe, didn't figure
Hmm.
that much because this was the holiday from history. This was the warm period when the world warmed up between possibly Cold War with the Soviet Union against Cold War with China, Cold War Two. So actually, one reason to focus on domestic policy is we're kind of getting back in the clothes of 1997, 98, 99, where the worst foreign policy problem probably looked like the breakup of Yugoslavia,
Hmm.
which of course was a catastrophic and very painful disaster for the Balkans, but didn't impinge nearly as much on public consciousness in Western Europe as did later wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I guess first thing to say is that looking at domestic policy is looking at it the way voters would have done before 9/11. Of course, and the second thing to say is that I'm a historian of domestic policy, so
Hmm.
it wasn't really in my frame or my skill set to write about foreign policy. And if I had, it would have been, it's probably a second book,
Hmm.
and it's certainly, as you intimate, a very, very different book. Because for those people who haven't seen it, who are listening, the book really looks at public services, and looks at healthcare, education, crime and justice, housing, etc. Because that's where I have cut my teeth as a historian. So that's where my skills are. So I'm just bringing over
Hmm.
how I looked at post-war Britain into the Blair era. So the second thing to say is I was never going to look much at foreign policy, and there are loads of people who look at foreign policy who, for instance, my colleague and friend Helen Parr, who looked at the Wilson era's foreign policy. Maybe she'd be someone to look at the foreign policy. I'm not nominating her if she's listening, but there are foreign policy historians out there who would do that. I think that the third thing to say is you're absolutely right, and there's nothing wrong with people saying who come and listen to book launches or talks saying, well, what about Iraq then? Because that was the number one element that the later Blair years was seen under, you could group under, and that was the key and important development. And they should say this. Someone said the other day, you can't have a moral calculus between hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead, probably, as far as we can tell,
Hmm.
and slightly better income for low-paid people back in Britain. But it's not really to build a moral calculus between
Hmm.
them because I just don't think you can. It's just that I'm saying, well, let's have a look at the domestic policy, which to some extent has got swamped by or overshadowed by the foreign policy disaster of Iraq. And of course, there's lots of other foreign policy that's also overshadowed by Iraq. There's Sierra Leone, there's Kosovo, there's Europe, there's the policy in the wider world. I mean, on the other hand, though, I think, oh God, what is it now? Fourthly, know, voters are well within their rights to say, what about foreign policy? Because I think foreign policy, as we see today, is probably the thing that the Prime Minister can affect quickest and with most executive fiat. What's the first thing the Prime Minister does? He goes and or she goes to go and sign the letters of last resort
Mhm.
for the on-station Trident submarine. And that's a very somber moment, which I think brings a lot of them up short. So there's nothing wrong with saying what about foreign policy. It's just that I haven't really written about it.
hmm And on that kind of like domestic agenda, one thing that I found particularly interesting that you articulate in the book is the idea of families at the centre of policy. And of course, Sure Start is kind of like perhaps maybe the most prominent, almost popular example of that, the one that people always cite. And it reminded me of during the 2001 election when Blair's on a phone in, and a single mother phones in and says, under the forthcoming reforms to the benefit system, will me being a stay-at-home mother still be seen, as an occupation? Will this be viewed as a job? And Blair responds something along the lines of saying, yes, no, of course, we respect the right of women to choose to raise their children, to be stay-at-home mothers as an occupation. Do you think that this is an important way to kind of like frame the sort of like the domestic policy making, in a sense, this idea of the focus on the family? And do you think that this is something that is perhaps a bit different to how policy is sometimes framed now? Seems something almost quite very 20th century about the framing of families at the centre of policy that perhaps doesn't quite get as discussed as much now in political discourse as it did in the 80s, 90s beforehand.
Well, the answer to that is how long have you got? Because this is a very complex, and I think you're right to say this is really central to New Labour thought. And it's really central to New Labour thought because I think it brings together lots of streams of the way that maybe not so much Blair, but more Brown, and certainly a lot of other New Labour thinkers like Harriet Harman. It's the way they thought about society because it brings together certainly a very noticeable feminist theme about women and work
Mhm.
and women who want to work, but also, as you say, women who might want to stay at home or women who might want to do both, women who might want to work part time because it's not a binary. I should say I'm speaking here as the son of a stay-at-home single mother, so I'm kind of speaking from experience here in the 80s, and it was pretty dreadful. And New Labour, I think, as you see in lots of life stories, made it a lot better for kids from those kind of backgrounds. So I should say I'm coming from kind of knowledge here. So it brings the feminist stream on board. It onboards it in that dreadful parlance into policy. The second stream of New Labour thought that it really builds in is communitarian thought, which very simply is the idea that you got to bring people together in the groups where they stand, so their families, their charities, their local neighbourhood, maybe their church, their school, and the
Mhm.
school becomes much more of an outreach kind of body under New Labour, doesn't it? It reaches out into the community. So you want people to live in communities, and the building block of communities for lots of maybe small c communitarian thinkers who appeal to Blair is the family. So there's a lot of family thinking coming from Blair's own ideology and outlook. And the other strand of that that's very important to Blair, as we know, is Christian socialism,
Mhm.
which is, of course, also privileges the family, the Holy Family, perhaps in a certain way. And indeed, within that, the Catholic social teaching that Blair owes some debt to, as throughout his time as Prime Minister, really a closet Catholic who doesn't want to move over to the Catholic Church because he thinks it will be controversial and
Mm.
it will distract from the business of government. So, and he goes to mass with his children, as people will know. So there's themes there that are embodied in family policy. There's Labour's feminist stream, which is really important in the 80s and 90s. And Harriet Harman says in her autobiography, her constituents who are mums with young children are coming to her all the time saying, I want to work, I want to work. And being able to at least enable some work is really, really important. But also goes with that is the communitarian thought that comes into Labour thinking in this period. And also it's Christian socialism, which is important to lots of Labour people, not just Blair. But it's really complicated because this is cross-cutting with a lot of very conservative thought, as I've already mentioned, under communitarianism, because Blair isn't shy of saying it's better that, it's the best, it's the ideal that genetic children live with their parents, at least at the beginning of his kind of reign as Labour leader or his time as Labour leader, which I don't think most people by the end of that period would necessarily say, and they definitely wouldn't now. He's not afraid to talk about that, but he's also not afraid to say the other side of because New Labour's always got two faces, two sides, two kind of ways of looking at the world. He says, well, it's better you live with your parents, but on the other hand, your genetic parents. But on the other hand, all families are families, and we honour all shapes of family. So it's really, really complicated because Blair wants to, as usual, he wants to appeal to small c conservative, and he is quite small c conservative, but he also has a liberal streak, and he also want to appeal to liberal voters. So that the family is just absolutely central to New Labour thinking. There's also loads of research at this time in education, in crime, that appeals to New Labour's idea of, do what works. That kind of FDR and Clinton appeal to American social policy, which is that you've got to intervene very, very quickly and early and in families to do social policy. But anyway, the answer to your question is, yeah, it's really important.
On that point of the kind of like the sort of like the two facing the sort of like the Janus element to New Labour, and of course a lot of people talk about the infamous TBGBs and that kind of like creative tension that there was between Blair and Brown. Do you think that this was part of New Labour's success in that at the front, particularly in the early years, there was kind of like this very clean, very polished, very sort of like easy to understand, not in any way sort of like cluttered public image, but behind the scenes there was quite a great deal of, creative sort of like maybe not disagreements but conflicts that powered some of the ideas behind New Labour, and that contrast between the very sort of like PR savvy front image and the much more kind of like messy creative background was key to New Labour's success.
Well, I think now we look back, I think we can see how perhaps exaggerated the personal rivalry and the kind of personal clash between the two teams under Blair at number 10 and under Brown at number 11 really was. I mean, we've had governments like Boris Johnson's where almost everybody resigns because they just can't trust him, really, basically. That's what happens. We've had governments like Theresa May's, which suffer the worst parliamentary defeats in modern history by hundreds and hundreds and have the majority of their MPs in the no lobby over Brexit. We've had, these governments that are absolutely riven by hatred, and we see Boris Johnson's team have moved over in some ways lock, stock and barrel to a completely new populist right party to oppose because they didn't like Rishi Sunak, and they very much disliked the kind of push of policy under him, and now they've ejected themselves to Farageism. So actually, when you look back, having a row about how much choice consumers, so-called, should have in the NHS looks a bit old-fashioned, doesn't it? So you've got to see these things in context. I think also you've got to see these things as, I think you suggested this in your question in some ways, you've got to see this as quite positive, because if you can have a massive bust up, but then you come together again, and who's the first person to phone up Gordon right at the end in 2010 is Blair. And who's the people, who's the person to come and talk to them and advise them? It's Alistair Campbell, who has been absolutely set against the Brown team from the start. So if you've got like someone who's basically a bit like a brother in Gordon Brown, who who you hate and you love. I don't think that's too strong a word. You're so close to that you basically have these titanic rows. That can actually help, and you can say, well, look, we've had this row, but how are we gonna solve it? Also, of course, I think Brown is pretty unsackable,
Mm.
so you just have to have it out with him. I think it does help also to appeal to a wide range of voters because Blair, when he needs to appeal to more left inflected voters, he can get Brown to go and talk to them with that real moral streak, that real kind of Presbyterian son of the manse streak that Brown has. So, and you see that in the 2005 election where
Mhm.
Blair is getting into trouble and there's worry that Labour might lose its overall majority. What does he do? He does the ice cream pact with Brown. And because he's such a light-footed politician, he laughs it off. He laughs it off and he says, well, you don't get many ice creams off the Chancellor. It's just like when Cherie is kind of dobbed in for slagging off Gordon. He says, he makes a joke of it and he says, well, at least she's not going to run off with the bloke next door. So I think it's a strength actually, although it undermines the government behind the scenes. For the most part, you can come to a compromise because if you remember the New Liberals,
Mhm.
it's not the public sector, it's not it's not national insurance and kind of employment exchanges that brings down the New Liberals. It's fighting a war. It's foreign policy,
Mhm.
just like with Blair and Brown. And you can pass it, you can agree on it. So where do they get to on foundation hospitals? They do a kind of compromise where they're not allowed to borrow and they're not allowed to build up a massive surplus that they can spend on their own. But on the other hand, they are able to kind of have a quasi market inside the NHS. So that's the kind of the compact between number 10 and number 11. You can
Mhm.
agree. So I guess the upshot of all that is that in some ways this is a kind of productive disagreement or a set of rows. It's a little bit like Wilson wanted between Callahan and George Brown in
Mhm.
1964. He wanted that kind of, what did he call it? Creative tension. Well,
Yeah.
you get a hell of a lot of creative tension from Gordon and Blair, don't Gordon and Tony, don't you?
Absolutely. And I think it's very interesting as well, the point that you make about Blair's kind of like light-footedness, his ability
Mm.
to almost dodge any attack that comes to him, both sort of like internally or externally during that period of office. Do you think that that was part of why he was so successful as a politician, is that he was able to maneuver himself quite easily, but in a way that never gained him perhaps the same reputation as maybe Wilson had from the 1940s right through to the 1970s of being a bit sort of shifty or a bit duplicitous because he was also simply quite light-footed.
Well, Harold had it more difficult, of course,
Hmm.
because the economy was worse, the confrontation with the unions was worse. And of course, as we've seen in recent years, inflation just eats everything. It just eats your electoral support, eats social relationships, eats the economy. And so Wilson had it more difficult, of course. But you make your own luck. And I think that Tony was someone who, what does uh, Bill Clinton say in that Channel 4 documentary that's on streaming at the moment? He could charm the squirrels down out of the trees. Well, there's a lot of squirrels and a lot of trees that get charmed down by Tony. And for instance, you look at that cabinet, the early cabinets before Iraq, and you've got quite a large coalition from left through centre to the right of the Labour Party. And indeed, if he hadn't had such a big majority, probably he'd have had a couple of Lib Dems in that cabinet as well. He certainly would have had Paddy Ashdown
Hmm.
in that cabinet if he could have managed it, if his majority had been small or non-existent. You've got Claire Short, Robin Cook, Michael Meacher, Tony Banks in the government. You've got, and eventually, despite the the unpleasantness, the misunderstandings, you've got Ken Livingstone with the kind of authenticated as Labour's candidate for Mayor of London. So he's not shy of bringing in the left. And he says to like Chris Mullin, I don't care if you're left wing. Are you good at being a minister? Which is just a way of charming Mullin, I think, into being Minister of State at the Foreign Office. So being charming, but equally working on that, I think is really important because sometimes people deprecate those skills of politicians, don't they?
Mm.
But I'm like, well, hang on, if you're a politician and a leader, isn't that your job to be good at politics? And as I get older, I suppose I see the category of good at politics as more and more important. And let's face it, if there weren't term limits, Bill Clinton would probably still be president, and still throws himself into these campaigns because he's so good at leading, and he's so good at kind of persuading people. On the other hand, you've got to have a political strategy. You can't just be a big smile. And Blair has a political strategy, maybe in a way that Wilson found much harder once his
Mhm.
initial kind of idea of planning had collapsed by the time you get to the 70s. And Blair's got a lot of political strategy. You can't just have the fleetness of foot, the lightness of foot, and the charm. You have to have a coalition of ideas. And so he has both, and he bridges all of that. And that's why it's such a potent that's why it's such a potent package for so long. We forget that he wins the 2005 election
Mhm.
after Iraq, and we also forget, I think, how close Brown comes to winning, at least in seat terms, of winning the 2010 election. If he just
Mhm.
won 30 more seats, of course, if wishes were dinners, I'd have a lot more food. But if he just won 20 or 30 more seats, maybe Brown, maybe a different Labour leader would have been continuing. So it was obviously strong, wasn't it?
Mhm. And that quite neatly leads on to the idea that, a lot of people have said from the sort of like the 80s through to the 90s that we were still living in Thatcher's Britain. To an
Mm.
extent, do you still think that we are living in Blair's Britain and we're living with kind of like the sort of shadow of him as a politician? No prime minister has, since him, managed to stay in office quite as long. The current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is obviously being comparatively and continually compared with Blair. Do you think we're still, to an extent, living in Blair's Britain?
Well, here's a terrible academic's answer, which is yes and no. Yeah, we are, and we're not. I mean, let's talk about the ways that we are living in his Britain. We're living in his public services. We're living in all of the buildings, all of the infrastructure that was so successful in that era of
Mm,
building up NHS capacity or schools. We look at that particular New Labour architecture, that kind of slightly postmodern, colourful, kind of light and dry Pomo architecture that a
mhm,
lot of health centres, a lot of community centres, a lot of schools are. So we are living in his world because we're physically living in the world of New Labour public sector architecture, and the Tories were able to live off that during relative austerity, just like they did in the 80s. They lived in Wilson's world, that all the health centres and youth centres that he'd built. So for, number one, we are living in his world. Number two, we are living in the shadow of his style of leadership, which is like Thatcher's. It's you're tough, you lead from the front, you give leadership, quote unquote, and you are sort of on your own right out, as a kind of striker, as a kind of the big front man who you lump it up to, or you give it to Saka on the right.
mhm.
Just give it to Saka and he'll just use the ball, or you get it up front to Kane and he'll just have a shot. So we are living in that model, but and that makes it really hard for other leaders. So Cameron and Osborne lived in thrall to the Blair example, calling him the master behind the scenes and saying, "Oh, we need to be more like Blair." But that just ended up with them seeming like a Blair tribute act.
Mm,
And so the ways in which we're not living under Blair's shadow so much is, I think, post great financial crisis, global financial crash, and especially in the world of instability, partly instability caused by climate change, like massive peaks of energy prices like we're going through now. I think that's very different from Blair's world because he lived in that kind of Goldilocks economy,
mhm.
the kind of holiday from history between the two Cold Wars that I was referencing earlier. So in many ways it was much easier, and he would have had to adapt. I'm sure he would say you'd have to change the third way, you'd have to adapt the third way to new techniques. And what I always say on the rare occasions when I talk to powerful people is, in an age of authenticity, in an age of fakes, you should just be yourself.
Mhm.
And I think to a certain extent, Keir Starmer is succeeding over the last couple of weeks a bit more, and he's strengthened his position for now a little bit because he's being himself, isn't he? He's
Mhm.
being he's being loyally. He's proceeding with a lot of caution in a
Mhm.
crab-like manner, in a slow manner. He's he's explaining himself in a very bureaucratic, quite boring way. And if you are yourself, I think you succeed more. So we are living in Blair's Britain with all those buildings, and we are living in Blair's Britain with loads of people saying, "Oh, why did Blair succeed, and why are we failing with leadership? We need to make the centre strong," like Blair says
Mhm.
in his book on leadership. But actually, we're not, and we shouldn't live under Blair because the times change, and we should just be like ourselves. You know, the next Labour leader and Prime Minister, if it's Andy Burnham or if it's Angela Rayner or whoever it is, they should be themselves and they shouldn't look to Blair. And I think that's in a way why Burnham and Rayner kind of live on the liminal edges of Starmer's world, kind of haunting him because they're really flavourful, aren't they?
Mhm.
They've got really strong brands that in some ways aren't Blairite, despite Andy's early Blairism.
Oh, absolutely. And as we are coming to the end of the podcast, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me, Glenn. I do have one final question for you. For anyone who has either read the book or is about to read the book, what one thing would you most like them to take away from reading the book?
Oh, well, that's a good one actually. And I hadn't thought about that, but I have got a really hopeful answer, which is that we live in an era where we're quite gloomy about Britain, I think, wrongly, because I'm probably the last bull in the bear market of UK futures, because the UK is one of the most successful inward investment places in the world. It's at the heart of a huge web of relationships which we can put to work. We've got a lot of low-hanging fruit of successes by getting closer to the EU that we can do. You know, I would say join the single market, but if that's not politically possible, just make trade and defence relationships a lot easier. They're just some examples of, I think, a much more hopeful future than a lot of people think. And we've just had a lot more hopeful news on public sector borrowing or maybe productivity. So we can do it and we can get forward and we can make a difference. And the Blair era shows you that you can do it. You can make really good public policy. When Blair comes to power, Britain's schools and hospitals are literally falling to pieces. When he leaves power 10 years later, Britain is shooting up education league tables and achievement of domestic qualifications, and its universities and its secondary schools after 16 are swelling with success. And league waiting lists in the NHS have been nearly abolished for waiting more than 6 months when they were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in 1997. So you can succeed, you can do it, you can take hope, and you can take some buoyancy from the Blair example. Don't be gloomy. Think about the next steps forward and how you can do it. And actually, this Labour government has put into train a lot of measures, for instance, a massive increase in infrastructure spending
Mhm.
that will pay off in
Mhm.
5 to 10 years, whether it's nuclear power or whether it's more hospital capital spending or whether it's more rail spending in the north of England. You've got to stick with it and you've got to have confidence because we've been here before, you know, suicide of Britain, collapse of Britain in the early 60s, you know, all the early 90s when people were saying, will Britain ever grow again? You know, lo and behold, you get two massive bursts of growth pretty much straight away. So just think of yourselves as at the bottom of the bear market. So there can be good times ahead and you can build better public policy. It just takes good design and it just takes some will and some patience. So there you go. Quite opposite to my social media personality. What I would like you to take from the book is take some succor and take some hope in the future.
Well, I think that is an excellent note to finish on, and I'm sure that people will take that from the book. And I hope anyone listening, if you haven't already got a copy of the book, goes out and buys it straight away because it's a fantastic analysis of the achievements of Tony Blair and New Labour. Thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me, Glenn.
That's quite all right. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.